Welcome. I'm Vicki Zakshevsky, the Education Director at the Greater Good Science Center and also one of the facilitators at the Summer Institute for Educators. In this first webinar, we're going to be covering the field of social emotional learning, or SEL. So take a look at some of the key topics for our webinar here. I do want to mention that SEL is the common term used in pre-K through 12 settings in the United States. Other countries often use other terms, which I'll talk about later. For our higher education participants, SEL is often referred to as life skills, relaxation, social skills, and a number of other terms. Yale and Harvard, of course, have their wildly popular courses on happiness. Sometimes these classes teach social emotional skills, sometimes not. The content for the happiness classes comes from the positive psychology field, which doesn't overlap a whole lot with SEL, but here and there can be some crossover. So in this webinar, wherever I can, I separate out SEL in pre-K through 12 from SEL in higher education. However, much of what is happening with SEL in the pre-K through 12 field is relevant to higher ed. So SEL is actually a fairly recent phenomenon in the field of education, but that's not really surprising as it's fairly new to research also. Dr. Richard Davidson, a leading researcher in the science of emotions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, tells the history of emotion research in his book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, a book, by the way, which I cannot recommend highly enough. He says that until the early 1970s, scientists were focused on cognitive development only, in how we perceive, remember, solve problems, speak, that sort of thing. Emotions were disruptive. To quote from his book, the idea that emotions might be beneficial or have any function other than interrupting behavior was antithetical to the idea of emotions as mental distractions and disruptions. Thankfully, Richie Davidson plunged into this new science of emotions, and now, thanks to him and many other researchers, we know that emotions are integral to how we navigate the world, how we learn, our relationships, our success in the workplace, life satisfaction. In fact, we now know that cognition and emotions go hand in hand. So moving on to the field of education, education itself didn't really pay much attention to emotions either until recently. Instead, as Linda Lantieri, one of the founders of the SEL field, describes, in the late 80s and early 90s, curricular programs were being created to fix the ills of society. Things such as violence, drugs, suicide, truancy, dropping out of school, smoking, teen pregnancy, but not by teaching students how to handle the difficult emotions and social situations that often lead students to engage in risky behavior. Rather, they taught students about the negative outcomes of these behaviors and that they just shouldn't do it. Just Say No to Drugs is a perfect example. Linda describes this as a deficit model approach, one that focuses on the negative rather than building on students' strengths and cultivating the inner tools and resources to live a socially, emotionally healthy life. But then Linda tells us in 1995, Dan Goleman published his wildly popular bestseller, Emotional Intelligence, based on research by Peter Salovey and John Mayer, which brought to society's attention the need to pay attention to our emotions. And here is Dan's definition of emotional intelligence. You can see it on the slide. At the same time, Linda, Dan, and a handful of others founded the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, which now serves as an umbrella organization for the field of SEL. CASEL's mission focuses on SEL research, practice, and policy in preschool through high school. For example, they provide district and school resource guides that offer practices for implementing SEL. They also vet the research and provide a list of evidence-based programs. They work at the state and federal level in the United States to make SEL part of educational policy. To find out more about what they do and what they offer, click on the link on the slide. CASEL provides a basic model and definition of SEL that many in the field of education use as a foundation to their work, which you can see here on the slide. I want to point out that there are literally hundreds of frameworks out there that cover social emotional development, but also include things like character or resilience or positive youth development or cognitive skills. There are so many frameworks that it can cause a lot of confusion trying to sort through them all. However, CASEL really is the leader in the field of SEL, so we're going to focus on this framework for this webinar. Another point I want to make is that researchers who are diving into these frameworks, trying to categorize them, are discovering that most do not directly address culturally or linguistically diverse students or students with disabilities, which, as the research is showing, are major limitations to these frameworks, including CASEL's. However, the field is growing more aware of these limitations and slowly but surely beginning to make some progress in these areas. But it's also important to note that these frameworks, including CASELs, can be seen as just starting points for discussions in schools on how to integrate pro-social development into learning. And then it's up to the educators and school leaders to make the framework relevant to their students. For instance, a Harvard professor told me that when he took CASEL's framework to a school in Shanghai, the educators took one look at it and knew it would not work for their culture. So they made adjustments to the framework to make it culturally appropriate for their students. Now, back to the CASEL framework. The 5 competencies in CASEL's model include 2 focused on the individual, self-awareness and self-management, 2 focused on others, social awareness and relationship skills, and 1 that puts it all together, responsible decision-making. More recently, CASEL has added to their model to show how these basic 5 competencies need to be integrated into all areas of a school, including classrooms, academic content, school practices and policies, such as discipline, school climate, including the collegial relationships between the adults, homes, and communities. What is important to note is that SEL focuses on the development of skills, which, from a research point of view, has made the field easier to study than the field of character education because it's easier to measure skills than character, something that we'll talk more about in the 3rd webinar. So let's dig into the 5 competencies and see what it means to put these in action, starting with self-awareness. Here is a basic definition of self-awareness and some key skills. Feel free to pause and read the slide on your own. For younger students, a lesson in self-awareness might involve making a list of how anger feels on the inside of our bodies and how it looks when we express it. For older students, self-awareness might be developed through small group discussion about the values displayed by a literary character and how this relates or doesn't relate to students' personal values. An equity-focused SEL practice might focus on having students examine how their identity may limit or enhance opportunities for both themselves and others, looking how factors such as racism, economic inequality, and sexism affect their lives. They then could reflect on changes they might make within themselves and in society to make the world more equitable. Here's the definition of self-management and some key skills. Again, feel free to hit pause to read the slide. A self-management lesson for younger students might focus on learning to express anger in a culturally relevant and healthy way. For older students, self-management might include creating long-term goals that benefit not just oneself, but the world beyond the self as well. And here's the definition of social awareness and key skills. A lesson in social awareness for young children might focus on students identifying ways in which they are different from each other and then celebrating those differences. For older students, you might have them watch Cleveland Clinic's amazing videos on empathy. You can click on the links on the slides to see them, and then have them make a video on empathy for schools. And here is the definition of relationship skills with some of those skills. A sample lesson for younger students might include how to deal with peer exclusion. For older students, a developmentally appropriate way to teach social skills might be in the context of community service, thus linking the skill to something relevant in their lives that helps them make the world a better place. And finally, the definition of responsible decision-making and some of those skills. Younger students might generate a list of possible solutions to a problem. Older students might develop their ethical thinking skills by debating whether or not it's the government's responsibility to pay for citizens' health care. Many schools and districts start with CASEL's model, but then make changes and additions to adapt to their specific needs or outcomes. For example, Sacramento City Unified School District added growth mindset as one of their competencies. Oakland Unified added the bolded italicized language to their definition of SEL, which you can read on the slide. One very important adaptation of the CASEL framework is this one put together by the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child. an organization that is focused on getting SEL training into teacher education programs. I'm not going to go over this framework during this webinar, but I wanted to bring it to your attention because this is where the SEL field is going next. If you want more information, click on the hyperlink in the slide. What is especially exciting to see is how social emotional learning is happening in all parts of the world. There's no way I can cover all the initiatives, but here are a few examples. In Europe, a group called the European Network for Social and Emotional Competence, made up of European academics, defines social emotional education as including CASEL's definition, but also positive psychology, positive education, resilience, and mindfulness. They also placed greater emphasis on the social self, including caring and inclusion. Some of their activities include conferences and publishing white papers and newsletters in efforts to spread what they call social emotional education throughout the EU. If you want to know more, I highly recommend the white paper hyperlinked on the slide. On page 39, the report lists what different EU countries are calling SEL. In the Middle East, both the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait have very strong initiatives around implementing positive psychology into schools. Again, positive psychology is not SEL, but both can contain elements of the other. In fact, we are so fortunate to have a group of teachers from Kuwait attending the Summer Institute this year, and so we'll be able to hear more from them about the amazing work they're doing. There's also tons going on in Australia, Singapore, the UK, India, so many countries. I don't have the time to cover everything here, but if you're interested in knowing more, I encourage you to look at reports from the Fondation Botin that looked at how SEL is happening in a number of different countries. The report also talks about the issues these countries are facing. Many of them are very, very similar to what the US is dealing with. Those of you who are coming to the Institute from outside the US, we always love to hear about the work being done in your country, your city, or your school. It really is one of the highlights of the Institute. Moving on to the research-based benefits of SEL, you're welcome to press pause and read through this slide. The field of SEL is very well researched with plenty of evidence to show that it works, but with a few caveats, of course, and I'll get to those in a minute. More specifically, in 2017, a meta-analysis was published that looked at 82 different interventions that involved 97,000 students from kindergarten through high school. The impact of the interventions ranged from 6 months to 18 years after the program ended. 38 of the studies were from outside the US. Again, feel free to press pause and read the slide. And finally, here are some findings besides the mental, physical, emotional, behavioral ones mentioned. In a 2017 report, some principals say SEL is essential and would help them build positive school climates, improve relationships between teachers and students, and decrease bullying. But they need training for teachers and access to research-based strategies. In a 2013 survey of teachers commissioned by CASEL, 93% of teachers want greater focus on SEL in schools, and this is actually starting to happen. And then in a 2013 survey of 704 employers, they said they had difficulty finding employees. Potential candidates had technical skills, but they needed social skills and decision-making and problem-solving skills. Now we're going to take a quick look at SEL in higher education. Just like K through 12 students, higher ed students can really benefit from SEL. Research with this group shows that stress and mental health challenges are very high for this population. The American College Health Association does a survey of U.S. college students every couple of years, and these are the latest statistics. As you can see, higher ed students are dealing with high levels of anxiety, depression, hopelessness, feeling overwhelmed by everything they had to do, feeling lonely, suicidal, self-injuring. These statistics are just too high. I also want to mention that researchers who look at these sorts of statistics point out that these kinds of issues did not start in college. They actually are indicative of lack of social emotional development and well-being in younger years as well. Again, pointing to the importance of developing students' social emotional competencies from a very young age. Research has found that social emotional competencies are associated with positive academic outcomes, including grades and retention. Students who score high in self-awareness and self-perception have been found to adjust the most successfully to higher education settings. whereas poor self-management leads to higher depression, anxiety, and stress levels. Part of this, of course, is because many students find themselves without the guidance of parents or a formalized school schedule. They also have to deal with roommates, faculty, and new peers. All these challenges require social-emotional skills such as self-management, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. As those of you who work in higher ed probably already know, no organization like CASEL or organizing framework like CASEL's 5 competencies exists for higher education. However, there is quite a bit of work happening in higher education that targets social emotional competencies. In the Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning, Colleen Conley out of Loyola University Chicago provides an overview of this work along with what works and what doesn't based on research findings. She starts by listing 6 different types of interventions. First, psychoeducational programs. These programs are didactic, providing information on topics such as stress, coping, and ways to relax, but they don't provide skills. Second are cognitive behavioral interventions. These focus on learning how to monitor, but also change one's thoughts in order to change one's emotional and behavioral reactions to situations. Third are meditation interventions. These often focus on teaching students to focus their mind on one thing, their breath, a sound, a part of the body. Fourth are mindfulness interventions. I won't go into detail about this since the second webinar covers this topic. Fifth are relaxation interventions that teach progressive muscle relaxation, visualization, and breathing techniques. And finally, social skills training in assertiveness, communication, and conflict resolution. So which ones worked based on Conley's strict research criteria? Only mindfulness. These programs had manuals to guide teaching. They also focused on didactic teaching of a practice and also an experiential element in which students practice skills in and out of class. Students could also see how mindfulness applied to many different aspects of life. What was promising? Cognitive behavioral, relaxation, and social skills interventions. What did not work? Meditation, psychoeducational interventions, and interventions without supervised skill practice. What's the takeaway? Supervised skill practice is key. You can talk about stress reduction all you want, but without actual skills, with actual practice of skills during the class, the intervention is most likely going to fail. So what does SEL look like in the classroom? This applies to both pre-K through 12 and university. Starting with standalone lessons. This is the usual way that people think about SEL. Oftentimes a 30-minute lesson taught once a week on a specific SEL skill such as emotion recognition, conflict resolution, or setting goals. These kinds of standalone lessons are particularly difficult to do as students get into middle and high school and at the college and university level. What SEL experts have now realized is that SEL needs to be integrated into every aspect of school. This makes it somewhat easier for educators of older students. For example, making discipline student-centered rather than punitive. Restorative justice is an example of this, as is the circles work, which we'll do at the Institute. Also, how teachers and professors relate to students. Research on the teacher-student relationship at the college level shows that how professors interact with students is critical. Students want professors to be open, available, and engaging. Making our teaching culturally responsive. Are we taking into consideration the backgrounds of our students in how and what we teach? Giving students responsibility and choice, especially at the higher levels of education, is critical. Our pedagogical methods can also include SEL practices, student discussion, teaching students to be self-reflective. There's wonderful work being done at the college level in self-reflection that can be adapted for younger students, and we'll do some of these at the Institute. Also, making the work meaningful and relevant to students' lives and having high expectations. Cooperative groups are important at every level, but especially as students enter teen and emerging adult stages. Research suggests that standalone SEL lessons do not work well for this age group. For example, discrete lessons on reading and managing emotions or role-playing conflict resolution situations, lessons you would typically find in K through 6 classrooms, don't go over so well for older students. Instead, skills are better taught when students' developmental needs are taken into consideration. As I mentioned in the research section, there are a few caveats to implementing SEL programs effectively. Here are some of them. As you can see from this list, there's much more to SEL than just a 30-minute lesson once a week. I won't read each item on this list. If you want more information, I encourage you to read the report hyperlinked at the bottom of the page. But just to point out some of the most important bullets here. Supportive context. School and college leaders need to cultivate a school climate in which SEL is encouraged and lived. Leaders as well as teachers need to walk the talk of SEL. Building the competencies of the adults, partnering with families, and extending SEL beyond the classroom are all critically important. For those of you who would like examples of how CASEL is implementing SEL in districts, check out their district resource center linked here on the slide. This has actual documents like interview questions, mission statements, professional development slides, and much more gathered from their collaborating districts that have been working for years on implementing SEL. Here are some sample SEL programs from the CASEL preschool, elementary, middle, and high school guides, hyperlinked on this slide. Being on the CASEL list means they have been tested for effectiveness through a randomized controlled trial, the gold standard of research. I am actually quite familiar with all of these pre-K through 12 programs, and I've noticed a few things about them. First, many do not cover all of CASEL's 5 competencies. If you would like an in-depth look at what specific skills 25 of these SEL programs do cover, I recommend looking at Harvard's report called Navigating SEL from the Inside Out, hyperlinked here. Second, some programs claim that they are culturally responsive. I would look very, very closely at how these programs claim to be culturally responsive and decide whether or not you think their approach is sufficient for your school's needs. Third, the programs use different pedagogical methods, so it's very important for teachers to have a say in choosing a program. Fourth, most of the programs are classroom-based. Only Ruler requires all the adults in the school to be trained in SEL skills, which is preferable. And then at the university level, most SEL is taught through classes mentioned in a previous slide. I haven't listed it here, but at least 1 or 2 universities that have sent people to the Summer Institute have implemented practices from Greater Good's Greater Good in Action website to teach SEL skills. And we'll go over some of this at the Institute. Our understanding of human social emotional development is growing by leaps and bounds, and as a result, the field of SEL is expanding and evolving at a very rapid rate. And SEL programs and CASEL itself have to work very hard to keep up with it all, as do all of us who are in the field. So some of the challenges and current trends in the field of SEL include culturally responsive SEL. As I mentioned, we'll talk more about the cross-cultural research and practices around not just SEL, but also mindfulness and character education. However, I want to point out that most SEL curricula was created by the white dominant culture in the US, so it promotes the skills, attitudes, and values of that culture. This is a huge limitation of the curricula. I've spoken to at least one major SEL program that is working to change its curriculum to meet the needs of diverse students, but much more needs to be done. SEL and equity. This is one of the biggest challenges faced by the SEL field right now, and it's working hard to address it. Oftentimes, SEL has been used as a compliance tool for students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, or as an anger management strategy in order to mask the strong emotions that result from being faced with racism, prejudice, and economic inequality on a daily basis. The term transformative SEL has been put forth by Dr. Robert Jagers and others at CASEL, defining it as a process whereby students and teachers build strong, respectful relationships founded on an appreciation of similarities and differences, learn to critically examine root causes of inequity, and develop collaborative solutions to community and societal problems. I highly recommend the SEL and Equity Report written by Jagers, hyperlinked here. For those of you who are coming from outside the US, I invite you to consider which students in your country may come from economically or culturally disadvantaged backgrounds, or who may be emigrated from another country, may be a refugee, or who traditionally may be seen as lower status in comparison to the country's dominant culture. The purpose of SEL. While there isn't a lot of public controversy around this topic, people do still question the reasons for doing SEL. For example, in the EU report mentioned on slide 20, the authors mention a 2015 OECD SEL report that, and I quote, reflects a lifelong learning, market economy, and socioeconomic outcomes approach to SEL, in contrast to a broader, more holistic conception of what it is to be a flourishing human being within a social Europe, and the promotion of active citizenship, diversity, equity, and social justice. In other words, is SEL used to create better workers, a ramped up version of the industrial model of education, or do we do it because we really care about creating human beings who are able to create flourishing lives for themselves? Assessment in SEL. Measuring SEL is actually very difficult. Most SEL research focuses on outcomes rather than whether students have actually learned the skills, something that is very, very hard to measure. However, there is a group of scientists and practitioners who are working on how to better assess SEL, going beyond just outcomes like these. If you're interested in learning more or being part of the SEL assessment initiative, go to the website hyperlinked on this slide. The dearth of SEL curricula for middle school, high school, and college students. There are very few curricular programs for these age groups, not just because there is very little time to fit in standalone lessons, but also because researchers are finding that it's more developmentally appropriate to integrate SEL skills into curriculum and projects rather than teach discrete skills. At the Institute, we'll learn about, discuss, and practice ways to do this. The developmental aspect of SEL. Knowing what students should be able to do socially and emotionally by what age is not totally understood or promoted by many SEL frameworks, standards, or programs, especially as social and emotional development is a lifelong process. We never stop learning how to work with our emotions or to get along with others or to handle conflict. This is one of the reasons it's so difficult to measure whether or not students have really learned SEL skills and whether or not they can apply them outside the classroom. Integrating SEL into the DNA of a school. Relying on SEL curricula that teaches an SEL skill for 30 minutes per week is just not enough. SEL needs to be integrated into every facet of school: the school climate, the relationships between teachers, students, school administrators, and parents, discipline policies, curriculum, professional development, adult well-being, after-school programs, the list goes on and on. This is a major focus of the Institute: how to integrate the science behind SEL, mindfulness, and character education into every part of the school. Education of the adults. As mentioned before, this is one of the key challenges of the field. One of the things that I've heard CASEL founders mention is that they now realize they should have started with the education of the adults first rather than the curriculum. Because, to use the old adage, you can't teach what you don't know. Most teacher education programs do not cover SEL, but here and there programs are starting to pop up at places like San Jose State and the University of Virginia, and also the recent Aspen report, A Nation of Hope, made a strong case for integrating this work into education. It called for teacher education programs to include the education of the adults. I want to close this webinar with something Caroline Chase, an Austin, Texas administrator, said to me once. Sometimes it's hard for the adults to connect to the fact that students are human beings. So SEL is the humanity that's created when we do things like check-ins with each other, which allow us to have real relationships, where you're really interested in somebody's story and you want to know what that person's about and why they are the way they are. I think this sums up what SEL, and as we'll see, what mindfulness and character education are really all about. They remind us of our own humanity and of each other's humanity. So this ends the first webinar. We thank you so much for listening and very much hope this has given a good lay of the land for SEL. Just to let you know, there will be an optional Q&A session about these 3 webinars at the end of Monday after we're done. So you're welcome to ask us whatever you like or offer your thoughts or comments on anything that we covered. Okay, next up is mindfulness and education. Thanks so much.